They said Seraphina Vale was born with smoke in her lungs and rage in her bones. They said she had killed her first dragon at 15, a young wyvern barely old enough to fly, and had not cried once. They said she had walked away from every battle with blood on her face that was never her own. They were right about all of it. She stood before the oldest thing she had ever seen. It did not attack. It had not fled. It had simply waited. Kill it, she told herself. Kill it the way you always do. She drove the ash fang through its chest. The creature trembled. Its massive head dipped slowly, not in pain, in something that looked, impossibly, like relief. Like a soldier who has carried a message across a continent finally reaching the door he was searching for. Its mouth opened, and in a voice like whined through ruined temples, like the last breath of a dying civilization, it spoke 4 words that would end the life she had always known.
At last, we've found you, my queen.
Seraphina Vale, the most feared dragon slayer in the history of the world, stood in the silence it left behind, shaking for the first time in 20 years. Chapter 1, in which the hunter begins to doubt the hunt. The valley was called the Ashen Throat by the cartographers who had dared map it. A long, jagged wound in the earth where volcanic rock met tundra frost, and the sky pressed low as a ceiling in a dungeon cell. No settlements existed within 40 miles. No trade routes crossed it. It was the kind of place people went when they wanted to be certain they would not be followed, and Seraphina had come here following rumors 3 months old, a dead man's journal, and the persistent, unreasonable instinct that had never once led her wrong. She had found the dragon on the 7th day of waiting. In all her years, she had learned the rhythms of her quarry the way a sailor learns the sea. Their territorial patterns, their resting cycles, the specific quality of silence that preceded an attack. Dragons were creatures of tremendous intelligence wrapped in the armor of something ancient and alien. They did not think the way men did. They did not fear the way men did. But they felt. She had always known that, in the private architecture of her mind where inconvenient truths lived. She had simply chosen not to let it matter. This one had been different from the moment she saw it. It had not fled at her approach. Most dragons fled or charged. The young ones charged out of bravado. The old ones fled out of wisdom. This creature had turned its great glacier blue eyes toward her and become still. Not the stillness of a predator calculating. The stillness of someone who has spent a very long time waiting for a person and is not entirely certain they deserve to believe their own eyes. It watched her cross the valley floor with an expression she could not categorize, and it had not once opened its jaws or spread its wings to take height. She had taken it as submission. She had been wrong. Now it lay still at her feet, and the 4 words it had breathed into the cold air clung to her mind like embers to cloth. At last, we've found you, my queen. She turned them over, looking for the angle of threat, the mechanism of manipulation. Dragons were intelligent. She had heard of them using words before, always as weapons, always as deception designed to make a hunter hesitate. She had never hesitated. Until now. She pulled the ash fang free and cleaned it on the frost-killed grass with the automatic efficiency of 2 decades. The action should have settled her. It always settled her. Her hands moved through the ritual, and her mind refused to follow, circling back again and again to that enormous head dipping low, to those blue eyes closing, to the exhale that had carried those 4 words like a prayer finally answered. She counted. It helped sometimes, when the memories of the farmhouse pressed too close. She counted the weight of every life behind her, 312 dragons. 312 threats eliminated. 312 victories for humanity. She had delivered the heads of the first 30 to the Warden's Council in the capital until they had made her a knight commander and begged her to stop bringing heads. She had killed in every season, in every climate, at every hour of the day and night. She had never questioned whether she should. The walk back to her camp took 40 minutes. She built a fire without thinking, ate without tasting, and lay in her bedroll staring at a sky full of stars she had never learned the names of because she had never needed to be still long enough to ask. Sleep came eventually, and with it, something she had not experienced in 20 years. A dream. Not the familiar nightmare of the farmhouse. Not the fire and the wings and the silence after. Something different. Something vast and golden. She saw a sky filled with creatures in flight, not attacking, not fleeing, but soaring in formation around a structure that floated impossibly above the clouds. A city. A city built on nothing but trust and ancient magic, its towers threaded with living light, its streets walked by humans and dragons side by side. She saw it from above, as though she too were flying. And at the center of that city, she saw a woman standing on an open platform at the summit of the tallest tower, her arms extended, her face turned upward. A crown of woven light rested on her head. Dragons circled her like a galaxy orbits a sun. Seraphina awoke before dawn with tears on her face and no memory of having felt anything at all. The things that began happening over the following week, she cataloged the way she cataloged everything. Methodically, without interpretation, in the worn leather journal she kept for mission records. A young drake had crossed her path on the mountain pass. She had raised the ash fawn. The drake had stopped, tilted its head at an angle that was almost quizzical, and then, rather than attacking or fleeing, it had bowed its narrow skull to the ground and held the position until she walked past it. She had written, unusual behavior. Possible illness affecting predatory instinct. On the third day, she passed through a ruin marked on no map she owned. The stonework was older than anything she recognized, not the blocky architecture of the current kingdoms, but something spiral and organic, as though the builders had grown the walls rather than stacked them. When she placed her palm against the largest archway, a pulse of blue light had traveled through the stone from her hand outward in every direction. The ruin had illuminated like a lantern. She had written, ancient construction, possible bioluminescent mineral reaction to body heat. She was running out of practical explanations. She was beginning to despise herself for needing them. Chapter 2. In which the stones remember what the books forgot. The capital city of Verindel had always struck Seraphina as the kind of place that was proud of itself in a way that should make sensible people nervous. Its towers were too tall, its markets too loud, its architecture too deliberate in its statement of permanent authority. She had returned to it 100 times over her career and left again as quickly as duty permitted, treating the city the way a surgeon treats a wound, with precise engagement and no lingering. This time was no different, or it should not have been. She filed her report with the Warden's Council through the usual intermediary, a stone-faced functionary named Aldrich who had been receiving her reports for 11 years without ever once asking how she was. She delivered the facts in the clipped shorthand the Council preferred. Location, target designation, confirmed kill, no civilian exposure, mission complete. She did not mention the words. She did not mention the dream. She did not mention the ruins that had lit up at her touch like a cathedral on a holy day. What she did, that same evening, was visit the city's oldest library. The archive of Ashimir occupied the lower levels of a tower so old its original builders were listed in the records only as the prior architects, a term that told a scholar exactly nothing and a soldier even less. The archivist was a woman in her 70s named Corvell, who had the focused stillness of someone who had spent so many decades among old things that she had partially become one herself. She did not seem surprised to see a bloodstained knight commander arrive at closing time. She simply looked up from her cataloging and waited. The Sky Dominion, Seraphina said. The words had arrived in her mouth without conscious decision, surfacing from the dream like objects floating up from deep water. I need everything you have on the Sky Dominion. Something moved behind the archivist's eyes. Not surprise. Something older and more careful. Most of what we have on that subject has been reclassified, she said. Reclassified by whom? By the Council. Over a period of several centuries. It's a standard historical review process. Serafina placed the ash fong on the reading table between them, not as a threat. She was meticulous about such things, but as a statement of patient intention. What can you show me? What Corvell could show her amounted to fragments. 3 paragraphs in a geography text that referenced the floating civilization of the pre-unification era. A line in an ecclesiastical record about the queen who spoke the dragon tongue. And a single illustration in a book so old its pages had been preserved under glass. A woman in armor standing on a high platform, arms extended, surrounded by dragons in flight, a crown of woven light on her head. Serafina stared at the illustration for a very long time. She had seen this image 12 hours ago. She had seen it from the inside. She returned to her room at the garrison and did not sleep. By morning, she had made a decision. She would go to the eastern ruins, the ones the scholars called the Dragon Roads, a network of ancient pathways marked with carvings too old to date and too elaborate to dismiss. She had ridden past them dozens of times over the years without stopping. She stopped now. She spent 4 days walking the Dragon Roads alone, and on each day the carvings did what the ruins had done. They responded to her touch with pulses of living blue light, as though the stone were breathing and she were the breath it had been waiting for. On the second day, she found the door. It stood in the face of a sheer cliff wall, a seam in the rock so precise it was invisible until she was 6 feet from it. There was no handle, no mechanism, no lock she could see. She pressed her palm flat against the stone. The door opened. Beyond it was a corridor cut from the living rock, its walls carved floor to ceiling with a language she had never seen, and at its end, a chamber lit by a source she could not identify, filled with objects that should not have survived 1,000 years but had. At the center of the chamber, on a plinth of the same spiral-grown stone she had seen in the valley ruin, was a crown. Not jeweled, not golden. It was made of something that looked like solidified light, and when she stepped toward it, it began, very softly, to glow. "You were not supposed to find this yet," said a voice behind her. "But you were always early." She spun. There was nothing in the doorway. Only the corridor. Only the carvings. Only the certainty, bone deep and inexplicable, that the voice had not come from outside her. It had come from somewhere inside her chest, from a place she had walled off and guarded for 20 years, from the part of her that had been 7 years old once, and had crawled from burning wreckage into a world that told her a single story about what dragons were and what they deserved. She did not take the crown. She was not ready. She left the chamber and sealed the door behind her and rode hard for 2 days without stopping, putting distance between herself and the thing in the cliff the way she had always put distance between herself and everything that could not be killed with a spear. But the dreams followed her. They always would now. She understood that somewhere beneath the noise of her refusal. Chapter 3, in which the hunter discovers she has always been the hunted. The summons arrived in a way that made the hairs on the back of Serafina's neck rise. Not through Aldrich the intermediary, not by courier, but by 2 members of the Warden's Council themselves, arriving at her garrison quarters before she had unsaddled her horse. They were polite in the specific, rehearsed way of people who have prepared their courtesy in advance because they anticipate needing it. They asked her to attend a review. They called it routine. They smiled at exactly the same moments, and she counted the seconds between their smiles and found them identical. She went to the review. She answered every question with the selective truth that was technically accurate. She had located the target. She had executed the mission. There had been no complications. She watched their faces as she spoke and cataloged the way a hunter catalogs a new environment, noting what moved and what stayed still, what they reached for and what they carefully did not look at. What they did not look at was the map on the eastern wall, the one that showed the Dragon Roads. They knew she had been there. She was certain of it before she left the room. Someone had followed her, or some form of surveillance she had not detected had registered her presence in the cliff chamber. The council knew about the door. Possibly they knew about the crown. And they were sitting across from her in a well-lit room with careful smiles, asking about mission reports. She had spent 20 years learning to read the language of prey. She was fluent in the grammar of something that did not want to be caught. She recognized it now in the faces of the men who had trained her. She left the council chambers and went immediately to find the one person in Verindel she believed might tell her the truth. His name was Oren Blackthorn, a disgraced historian whom the council had stripped of his academic credentials 12 years ago for what the official record called promulgating historical fictions. She had dismissed him as a crank when she had first heard of him. She had been wrong about many things lately, and she was becoming accustomed to the sensation. Oren lived in a single room above a tannery in the lower city, surrounded by stacks of papers so extensive that arriving at his door required navigating through organized avalanches of research. He was a small, sharp-eyed man in his 50s who looked at Serafina with the studied nonchalance of someone who had expected her to arrive sooner. He offered her tea. She accepted. He did not ask why she had come, which meant he already knew, which meant the shape of the situation was larger than she had estimated. "The Sky Dominion," she said, again without deciding to. The name was becoming a key that opened things she hadn't known were locked. "Ah," said Oren Blackthorn. And then he told her everything. The civilization had existed for over 400 years before its destruction. Humans and dragons had not merely coexisted. They had built together, the dragons contributing a living magic that humans alone could not access, the humans providing the architectural and agricultural systems that the dragons' nomadic nature had never developed. The partnership had been formalized under a single ruler, a woman of unremarkable noble origin who had discovered, in her 20s, that she could hear dragon minds as clearly as human voices. She had not conquered the dragons. She had listened to them. She had mediated between human lords who wanted the dragons as weapons and dragons who wanted to be left in peace. She had built something unprecedented, a society in which two very different kinds of intelligence chose to depend on each other. Her name had been Eloria, and she had not died when the Sky Dominion fell. Or rather, she had died, but she had not ended. The dragons had done something at the moment of the kingdom's destruction, something whose nature Oren could only approximate from fragments and inference. They had anchored her soul to the pattern of the world itself, tied her existence to the heartbeat of the magic that connected living things. She could not be permanently killed. She could only be reborn. "They've been looking for her," Serafina said. Her voice was very level. She was concentrating on keeping it level the way a person concentrates on keeping their hands steady while defusing something dangerous. "For 1,000 years," Oren confirmed. "Every generation, and every generation, the ruling dynasty has found her first and arranged things." He paused, looking at his tea. "Your family, Serafina. The farmhouse. That fire. That was not an accident of wild dragons in the countryside." The garrison room went very quiet. In the quality of that quiet lived 20 years. Chapter 4, in which the truth arrives wearing the shape of a childhood memory. There are revelations that arrive as lightning, sudden, blinding, impossible to misread. And there are revelations that arrive as the slow surfacing of something that was always beneath the water, something your body knew before your mind permitted the knowing. This was the second kind. Serafina sat in Oren's paper-stacked room and felt the information settle into her bones like cold, like the specific cold of a winter that was never going to end, and understood that part of her had known this for a very long time. The fire had been set, not by dragons, by men with torches and orders from a ruling house that had spent a millennium eliminating every reincarnation of Eloria before she could grow old enough to understand what she was. They had used dragons as the explanation because the explanation was already written into the history books they controlled. Dragons were monsters. Dragons burned villages. Dragons were the reason humanity needed strong rulers and strong hunters. The story was its own proof. The proof was its own story. She had been the instrument of her own erasure. For 20 years, the Crimson Huntress had hunted dragons, the creatures who recognized her, who had been waiting for her, who had spent 1,000 years searching, and every dragon she killed had weakened the very magic that kept the world alive. The dynasty had not needed to kill her this time. They had trained her to destroy herself. How many? She asked. Her voice was quiet and very precise, the way it went when she was about to do something that required absolute control. How many reincarnations before me? Orin looked unhappy about the answer. That I can document? 11. That I suspect? More. 11 women who had lived their lives and been erased or redirected or killed before the knowledge could reach them. 11 cycles of a dragon species slowly dying, a world slowly weakening, a truth buried ever deeper under ever more elaborate history. And now her, the 12th. The one who had survived by becoming the thing the dragons feared, which meant the thing that feared everything about them could not see the safeguard she actually represented. She asked him about the dying. He showed her his records with the grim efficiency of someone who had been waiting a long time to show them to someone who mattered. The numbers were not dramatic. They were the slow arithmetic of decline. Dragon populations had been falling since the Sky Dominion's destruction, not from hunting alone, but from a systemic withdrawal of the magical connection between species. As the connection attenuated, the world's living systems had begun, very gradually, to fail. Crop failures attributed to weather. Oceanic disruptions blamed on currents. Seasonal irregularities dismissed as natural variation. Each individual event was explicable. The pattern beneath them was not. The world was dying. It was dying slowly enough that most people could not see it happening. It was dying in exactly the way things die when the fundamental architecture of their existence is being quietly disassembled piece by piece. And beneath it all, and this was where Orin's research grew fragmented and frightened, there was something else. Something the Sky Dominion had known about and spent for centuries keeping contained. The dragons had not only been partners in civilization, they had been anchors. The magic that connected them to the living world had also served as the membrane between this world and something older, something that had existed before the sky was separated from the earth, before the first living thing drew breath. The old texts called it the void below. The dragons had called it, in the few first-hand accounts Orin possessed, simply the hunger. As the anchors die, Orin said carefully, the membrane thins. Whatever is imprisoned beneath the skies has been waiting for exactly this. Seraphina stood. She walked to his single window and looked out at the city she had served. The towers too tall, the markets too loud, the architecture of confident authority built on a foundation she now understood was designed to collapse. Who in the council knows? She said. All of them, Orin said. It's in the founding documents of the dynasty. They know what they're trading. They know what happens when it all finally unravels. They simply believe it will not happen in their lifetimes. He paused. They may be right, or they may have miscalculated. The timeline is accelerating. She turned back to him. Her face had settled into a particular expression he would describe later to the people who asked, and many people would ask, as the expression of someone who has been carrying a wound for 20 years and has just discovered that the wound is the only thing that has been keeping the poison from spreading. Grief and purpose in the same instant. The end of one story and the first sentence of the next. The crown and the cliff, she said. Can it be taken safely? Only by her, he said. Only by Eloria. He looked at her for a moment. Only by you. Chapter 5. In which the language she forgot returns. She returned to the cliff alone, before dawn, riding hard enough that the horse was blowing great clouds of steam into the cold air by the time she arrived. She told herself this was tactics, move before the council acted on whatever surveillance had tracked her earlier. It was tactics. It was also terror of a specific kind. The terror of being ready for something you have told yourself your whole life you would never want. The door opened the moment she touched it. Not even a breath of hesitation in the stone. It recognized her the way a door recognizes a key it was made for, with the silent, immediate authority of a thing returning to its purpose. The corridor was as she had left it. The chamber was as she had left it. The crown on its plinth glowed the moment she crossed the threshold, not urgently, not in alarm, but with the steady warmth of a fire that has been burning a long time in an empty room waiting for someone to come home to it. She stood before the plinth and did not move for a long time. The memories had been building since the first dream, not arriving all at once, but surfacing the way memories do, fragment by fragment, each one clicking into the architecture of a life she hadn't known she'd lived. She remembered the sound of dragon voices in her mind before she remembered the words they used. She remembered the feeling of the sky from above before she remembered that she had never flown in this body. She remembered a name spoken with affection by enormous creatures that had no right to affection and had possessed it anyway. Illoria, the one who listens, the one who speaks back. She picked up the crown. It weighed almost nothing. In the moment of contact, the chamber flooded with a light so total she lost the edges of her own body, lost the distinction between where she ended and where the world began, and in that dissolution, in the 3 seconds between one breath and the next, she remembered everything. Not as narrative, as experience. For 100 years of a life so different from this one that she had no framework for it except the wordless certainty of recognition. She had loved dragons. Not as pets, not as weapons, not as abstractions, as minds, as persons, as the other half of an understanding that had made the world richer than it had any right to be. She had sat in council with creatures larger than houses and argued with them and laughed and wept and built something together that the smallness of human ambition had eventually found intolerable. She had died knowing they would find her again. She had died trusting the pattern she had helped to make. She came back to herself kneeling on the chamber floor. The crown rested on her head, and she had not placed it there. Her cheeks were wet. The ash fawn lay beside her on the stone, and she looked at it, really looked at it, for the first time, and understood that the bones it was made from were not from her first kill. They had never been dragon bones at all. The weapon had been given to her already made, by a man from the council who had told her it was traditional, who had told her it was made from the first dragon ever slain by a warden's knight. Another lie. One more piece of a story designed to keep her pointed in the wrong direction. She left the spear on the chamber floor. She walked out into the early light with the crown on her head and her hands empty, and the first dragon found her before she reached her horse. It came from the north, small, not yet fully grown, its scales the pale green of new leaves, its eyes the same blue she had seen in that valley. It landed 20 feet away and prostrated itself flat against the earth, and a sound came from its throat that was not quite a word in any language she had ever learned in this lifetime, but that she understood with absolute certainty nonetheless. "My queen, we have been waiting." "I know," she said, in a language that came from somewhere before memory. "I'm sorry it took so long." By the time she reached the treeline, there were 7 dragons behind her. By nightfall, there were 43. They came the way displaced things come home, not in celebration, not in triumph, but in the quiet, profound relief of something that has been wrong for a very long time beginning, at last, to be corrected. Chapter 6, in which the kingdom she served turns its weapons toward her. The declaration came within 48 hours. She had not expected them to move so fast, and the speed of it told her something important. They had contingency plans. They had always had contingency plans. A dynasty that had spent 1,000 years managing this particular problem did not scramble. It activated procedures that had been maintained across generations, updated and refined until the response to a returned dragon queen was as precise as a military drill. The proclamation was read at every city gate, every market square, every garrison posting from the capital to the coast. Seraphina Vale, formerly Knight Commander of the Warden's Order, had been found guilty of conspiring with the kingdom's oldest enemies. She had been seen consorting with dragon forces. She had stolen a sacred artifact from an ancient ruin. She was to be considered armed, extremely dangerous, and to be taken dead or alive at the discretion of the arresting force. There was a reward. It was very large. In every city, every soldier who had fought beside her read the proclamation and made a choice. Most chose the dynasty. Some did not. She had been betrayed before in the field. It was an occupational hazard of working in environments where information was currency, but betrayal by an institution was different. It had a different texture. She had given the wardens order 20 years. She had bled for them, refused comfort for them, built her entire identity on the service she rendered them, and they had spent those 20 years counting on her to be precisely what she was. Too focused, too committed, too certain of the righteousness of her purpose to look sideways at the scaffolding. The first hunter reached her camp 3 days after the proclamation. He was one of her own, a man she had trained personally, a tracker named Davith who had learned patience from her and whose skills she had helped refine over 4 years of shared campaigns. He came alone, which meant he was either very brave or very stupid, and she knew him well enough to know it was neither. He came alone because he was not there to capture her. "They're sending a battalion," he said without preamble, crouching at her fire with the businesslike air of someone delivering operational intelligence. "Arrowhead formation. 2 siege weapons in the rear column. They believe you have a significant dragon force, and they want to end this before it becomes a story the common people have time to form opinions about." "How long?" 4 days to your current position. Less if they get updated intelligence on your movements." He paused. "There are others who won't come for you. Jolin, Mira, the Ashfield squad. They've gone quiet, not defected, but not tracking either. Buying time." She looked at the fire and thought about 4 days. 4 days to do something unprecedented. Not just survive, not just run, but build. The dragons behind her numbered over 200 now, drawn from territories across the continent by a call that moved through the magical substrate of the world the way a current moves through water, carried by the crown she wore, by the voice that had returned to her in that cliff chamber. They were with her, but they were also dying. She could feel it now, that slow withdrawal, that fraying connection. Some of the older ones had the look of trees in drought. There was a weakness in them that had nothing to do with wounds. She needed time she did not have. She needed allies she did not yet possess. She needed to give the common people, the farmers watching their crops fail, the sailors watching the seas shift, the mothers watching the seasons arrive wrong, a reason to choose a story they had never been allowed to hear over the one that had been told to them since birth. "What would it take," she said, "to get those 3 squads openly on my side?" Davith considered. "Proof," he said. "Not of what the council is. Everyone already suspects that. Proof of what you are. Proof that what you're doing is the only thing that saves them." He looked at the dark shapes of dragons resting at the camp's perimeter, their scales faintly luminous in the firelight. Do something impossible. Something they can't explain away. In the morning, she walked to the edge of the dying river that ran through the valley. Its water level had dropped 3 feet in a season, its banks cracking in patterns the locals called the Earth's grief lines. And she knelt at the waterline and placed both hands in the current and opened the connection she had been tentatively, carefully touching since the cliff. She opened it fully. She let the crown's light travel through her and into the riverbed, and the dragons around her raised their heads and joined it, added their own vital force to the current she was building, and the river ran faster. The banks held moisture they had not held in years. Small, inarguable, documented by 7 witnesses who had not been invited and would tell everyone they knew. It was a beginning. The beginning was always small. Chapter 7. In which enemies become the only available family. She had always worked alone. It was not merely professional preference, but something structural, a belief, built from the rubble of her childhood, that the only reliable protection against further loss was to keep the circle of dependency small. 1 person, 1 spear, 1 mission. The arithmetic was clean. But the world she was navigating now could not be navigated alone, and the person she was becoming could not afford the safety of solitude any longer. Eloria had never worked alone. Eloria had been constitutionally, philosophically, functionally incapable of working alone. She had been made for connection the way a bridge is made for spanning. Serafina was discovering what it meant to be a bridge after 20 years of being a wall. The first human ally, after Davith, was Oren Blackthorn, who arrived at her camp in the company of 3 graduate students who had been expelled from the academy for refusing to sign a letter condemning his research. He brought records, connections to sympathetic communities in 6 cities, and the kind of absolute conviction that comes from spending a lifetime being right about something that everyone around you insists cannot be true. He was insufferable in small doses and indispensable in larger ones. The first dragon ally she formally acknowledged, as opposed to the mass of followers whose devotion humbled and overwhelmed her in equal measure, was an elder named in the dragon tongue as a concept she translated, inadequately, as Ash Speaker. Ash Speaker was enormous, ancient, and had the serene manner of a creature that had survived long enough to find patience genuinely interesting rather than merely useful. It had been waiting in the Northern Territories for 60 years, its movements so careful and its avoidance of human settlements so meticulous that no warden's hunter had ever had cause to track it. "You smell of the old blood," Ash Speaker said to her, the first time they spoke mind to mind. Not an accusation, simply an observation, the way one might note the weather. "I know what I've done," she said. "We know too," it replied. "We forgave it before you did it. That is what we have always done. It is what you taught us once." The battalion reached them on the 4th day, as Davith had predicted, and it was larger than his intelligence suggested. Not a battalion, but a full war host, 1,400 soldiers, the siege weapons visible at the rear as promised. They deployed on the plain below the valley's northern lip with the practiced efficiency of a force that had drilled this engagement type. Their commander, a man Serafina did not recognize, which told her they had brought someone from the eastern garrison specifically because the local forces knew her too well, called for her surrender in the formal language of the warden's code she had sworn her career by. She rode out to meet him alone. No weapons. The crown on her head catching the morning light. Ash Speaker and 40 dragons visible on the ridge above her camp. Perfectly still, positioned not to threaten, but to be seen. She stopped her horse 20 yards from the commander's advance party and waited. He delivered his terms. Surrender, stand trial, accept the judgment of the council, and the dragons in her company would be guaranteed safe passage out of the kingdom's territories. He said this without any indication that he believed it would be honored. His voice had the specific neutrality of a man reading a document he knows is false to a person who knows it too, for the benefit of the witnesses on both sides who must be given the form of legitimacy before the violence begins. She did not negotiate. She did something he had not prepared for. She turned her horse, raised her voice to carry to both sides of the field, and told the truth. Not all of it. All of it would take days, but the core of it. The farmhouse, the orders, the dynasty's 1,000-year pattern, the dying world and the hunger beneath it, the dying river that had run full again in an hour. She talked for 20 minutes to 1,400 soldiers in the early morning cold, and she watched the faces in the forward ranks do what human faces do when they encounter a story that explains things their own story never could. She rode back to her camp. 63 soldiers followed her. It was not the battalion's collapse. It was enough. Chapter 8, in which the thing beneath the sky runs out of patience. The world did not wait politely for her to resolve the political situation before presenting its larger emergency. This was, she would reflect later, entirely appropriate. The world had never been in the business of waiting. She had simply been too focused on the small urgencies to see the large one accelerating beneath them. The first sign was thermal, a heat that had no weather origin, rising through the rock in the eastern territories in waves that cracked the stone and made the groundwater boil. The second sign was the silence. Birds abandoning a territory of 200 miles, animals fleeing, the instinctive mass evacuation of every creature with a nervous system evolved enough to know when something was wrong with the ground beneath it. The third sign was what Ash Speaker felt through the network of magical connections and described to her in the dragon tongue as the sound of something chewing through a wall it has been working on for a very long time finally reaching open air. The hunger was not a creature in any sense the word typically implied. It was older than creatures. It was older than the distinction between living and not living. The Sky Dominion had not imprisoned it. They had, through the web of dragon-human connection, maintained a counterpressure that held the membrane between this world and the dimensionless dark behind existence sealed tight enough that the hunger could not find purchase. 400 years of that civilization had been, in part, one long-sustained act of keeping a door shut. When the Sky Dominion fell, the door had not opened, but it had begun, slowly, to breathe. 1,000 years of dragon deaths. 1,000 years of thinning membrane. 1,000 years of the hunger pressing its attention against the weakest points and finding them, over centuries, growing weaker still. The breach point was a mountain called the Null Spine, a geologically anomalous formation in the Eastern Territories that the Sky Dominion's maps had labeled in a language she now read as the last lock. Do not leave unguarded. They had left it unguarded 1,000 years ago because they had not had a choice. Now the lock was failing. She felt it through the crown. A cold pressure at the edges of the magical network, a sound below sound. A hunger so vast and impersonal that confronting it directly would have been like a candle confronting a storm. She understood immediately why this could not be addressed militarily, could not be negotiated with, could not be fled from. It was not interested in any of those interactions. It simply wanted, in the way a physical void wants, in the way absence wants, to fill itself with everything that existed. The dragons felt it too. She watched Ashpeaker's composure, which she had come to think of as geological in its stability, develop the first crack she had ever seen in it. The elder's eyes went distant, and its vast frame became very still with the effort of processing something ancient fear. How long, she asked, before it breaks through entirely? Weeks, Ashpeaker said. Possibly less. The membrane is thinner at that point than anywhere else. It has been the focus of its attention for the last century. She thought about the math of it. The counterpressure needed to reseal the lock was, according to everything she had remembered and everything Ashpeaker could explain, proportional to the number of living dragons and the strength of their connection to the magical network. She had 314 dragons. The Sky Dominion at its height had maintained the seal with thousands. 314, many of them weakened, none of them at the full vital strength the connection required. It was not enough. It should not be enough. But there was a variable the Sky Dominion had not possessed in its final days, and the variable was her. Eloria, reborn. Eloria, who had spent 20 years developing the specific physical and psychological capabilities of a world-class hunter, and who was now, additionally, the living key to a magical system that had been sitting dormant for a millennium, waiting for her to pick it back up. She thought about the battalion she had partially turned. She thought about the 63 soldiers who had followed her. She thought about the cities where the crops were failing and the rivers were dropping and the seasons were wrong and no one in power would tell them why. She thought about what Eloria had been. Not a conqueror, not even a warrior, a peacemaker. A woman whose power had come from her willingness to stay in the unbearable middle ground between two kinds of being who feared each other and insist, day after day, that there was more to gain from trust than from separation. She sent Davith back to the capital with a message for the soldiers who had gone quiet, for the people in the markets where the proclamations had been read, for the farmers who had no explanation for what was happening to their fields, for anyone who had ever looked at the official story and felt, in the privacy of their own experience, that it did not quite cover everything they had seen. The message was simple: come to the Null Spine. Come and see. The world needs witnesses as much as it needs warriors, and the door we are trying to close can only be held by what we choose to be together. Chapter 9, in which the Queen remembers what she was built for. They came. Not all of them. Not even most of them. The dynasty's grip on the story was still strong enough to keep the majority of the army in place, and the capital's garrison had been locked down before Davitha's message could reach its intended recipients in sufficient numbers. But enough came. Farmers from the eastern territories who had watched their wells run dry and their livestock sicken. 300 soldiers who had either received the message or heard it secondhand, and whose loyalty to the institution had been quietly eroding for years beneath the weight of things they were told not to notice. Scholars from 6 cities who had spent careers being punished for asking the wrong questions. Oren's network, activated in 24 hours, producing people who arrived with supplies and no military training, and the specific fierce calm of individuals who have decided to act on something they believe regardless of outcome. And dragons, drawn from the furthest edges of the continent, from territories no human had mapped, from populations so reduced they had not been seen in generations. They came the way migratory creatures come to a place their instinct names as essential, overriding every obstacle and every fear with the deeper imperative of the pattern. 642 dragons by the time she stood at the base of the null spine and put her hands on the stone of it, and felt the hunger pressing against the other side like an ocean against a cracked hull. The mountain range that held the null spine was called the Greybacks by the locals, a name so purely geographical it contained no memory of what it protected. The lock itself was not visible. It existed below the surface, in the geological layer where the world's magical substrate ran closest to the physical rock. She could feel it through her boots, through the crown's connection to the network, through the 1,000-year-old memory of having designed this system with Ashspeaker's predecessor in the first decades of the Sky Dominion. She had made it. She understood its architecture better than anyone alive. She stood at the null spine's base and opened the connection fully for the first time. Not the careful, metered opening she had been using since the cliff chamber, but the total opening, the one that had no protective boundary between herself and the full force of the magical network. She felt every dragon behind her the way a conductor feels every instrument in the orchestra, individual voices within a single sustained note. She felt the humans too, differently, not as magical nodes, but as weights in the balance, presences that mattered in the system the way witness matters in a ritual, the way observation changes what is observed. Together, she said, in the language that was older than nations. Now, the dragons answered. All of them, simultaneously, in the way a choir finds a note, not by imitation but by resonance, each voice finding its own frequency within the chord. The sound was below hearing and above it, simultaneously. It moved through the rock. It moved through the people gathered on the mountainside, who felt it as a physical sensation in their chests, and many of whom wept without knowing why. The specific weeping of recognition, of something acknowledged that had been waiting a long time to be acknowledged. The hunger pushed back. This was the part Seraphina had not been able to fully prepare for, the part that required something beyond planning, beyond strategy, beyond the careful deployment of calculated force. The hunger was not intelligent in any way she could engage. It was not malevolent in the way a person is malevolent. It did not choose to consume. It simply was the property of consumption, the way a fire is not malevolent but burns regardless. Opposing it was not combat. It was endurance. It was the sustained decision, second by second, to remain present in the face of something that wanted nothing more than for all presence to end. She stayed present. The dragons stayed present. The humans on the mountainside, without fully understanding the mechanics of what was happening, stayed present too. Their witnessing a form of participation, their attention a thread in the weaving. The membrane held. It did not merely hold. It strengthened, drawing on the connection being rebuilt between species, on the restoration of the pattern that had been fraying for 1,000 years. It took 11 hours. She felt every minute of them. When it was over, when the lock had resettled into its architecture and the hunger had withdrawn to the distance it would now maintain indefinitely, contained but not destroyed, manageable but never gone, she collapsed to her knees on the cold rock and let the crown's light dim to a steady warm glow. Ash Speaker rested its enormous head on the ground beside her. She put her hand on the ridge of its jaw, and they stayed that way for a long time, the Queen and the Elder, in the silence of something finished. The Council sent a final force 3 days later. It did not arrive in war formation. It arrived because the soldiers who had come to the Null Spine had gone back to the capital with what they had seen, not a rebel's account, not a political argument, but the plain, witnessed fact of a mountain that had been cracking and boiling from below for 3 months suddenly going still. The plain, witnessed fact of 600 dragons that could have destroyed the pursuing army, choosing instead to land, one by one, and fold their wings and wait. The plain, witnessed fact of the season, which had been arriving wrong for 2 years running, beginning that week to correct itself. The dynasty was not overthrown that day. That work would take years. The slow, unglamorous labor of historical correction, of institutions reformed, of a story retold until the people who had always half-doubted the old one had enough of the new one to stand on. But that day, in the capital, 3 of the 5 council members resigned. The founding documents were seized by the Academy scholars. The lock on the archive of Ashenmere was broken, and people began reading. It was not an ending. It was a threshold. It was the specific kind of beginning that is only possible after everything has been lost and found in the same breath. The beginning that knows its own cost and chooses anyway, with clear eyes and open hands, to step across. The Crimson Huntress was gone. The Dragon Queen had come home.